You're watching Behind the Headlines. I'm Lee Pacchia. A new survey put out by Deloitte's corporate restructuring group looks at how executives manage companies through periods of crisis. And the results might come as a surprise. Joining me now is William Snyder. He's the co-head of Deloitte's restructuring group. We're happy to have him in the office. Welcome.
Good to be here.
So you asked 1,200 professionals from all kinds of industries on the emotions of change in turnaround scenarios. Really interesting concept. The question that jumped out at me in the first instance was where you asked professionals what they thought of their organization's leadership was, what organizations' leaders would be most reluctant to do in the midst of the crisis, and the majority of respondents focused on the idea of communication, either to vendors, to lenders, or to their employees. Why do you think that is? That's a really interesting concept. Why is communication in a crisis scenario so important to these people?
Well, communication in a crisis is probably one of the most fundamental things that has to be done properly. And first you have to admit you have a problem and communicate that. Then you have to find a fix and communicate it. Then you have to find a consensus through communication. Then you have to execute it through communication. And then you have to go forward. So communication is actually the red thread that goes throughout an entire restructuring. And in this first question that was asked, virtually 50% of the respondents said that management was reluctant to either admit they had made a mistake or discuss it with the employees. So 50% of the respondents are saying, hey, management is failing to admit there's an issue, and they're failing to admit to their employees there's an issue. So they can't even come to an agreement that they have a problem. So until you get to that, you can't fix it.
Yeah.
So it's a huge issue.
Just watching so much of the bankruptcy and restructuring space, it's striking to me that there's this tendency to slow certain types of communication down once a company runs into trouble. It's certainly understandable because turnaround situations are necessarily fluid. The dynamic is constantly changing. But are corporate managers necessarily wrong to slow certain elements of communication down when they enter a distress zone?
Well, I think there, yes, in some instances. Let me just tell you though, if you have a problem, it's best to admit you have a problem. You have to get out there. If you're a public company, you don't have a choice, right? I mean, there are rules and laws as to when you disclose things. So, but I think the issue is that people are afraid to discuss it because they don't have a solution. Now, there is a problem in discussing partial solutions. You see that in the government all the time. They release little factoids out that, you know, they're going to do this or that, and then there's a big movement to squash it because no one wants a solution. So many times it is best, before you announce a solution, to have a complete one, a cohesive solution, and say, okay, here's a problem. You announce that first, and you say, and we're going to deal with it, and then later you come back with a cohesive decision and say, this is how we're going to fix it. That makes sense. But to withhold data as to you have a problem, thinking nobody realizes it, is wrong. I actually had a client that would not fly on the same airplane with his CFO because he thought if he was seen on the same airplane with CFO, somebody might think there was a problem because they never flew together. I had another client once that quit publishing financial statements for 6 months because they might get out. And so it's just, and in today's world of social media, everybody knows you have a problem. When you're in trouble and you're not paying your vendors, they all talk. Your customers know you're not getting deliveries. Your employees know you're not delivering product. Everybody knows your sales are down 20%. The whole world knows. Many times, it's just the management that's in denial.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up the anecdote about the CFO and CEO flying together. You know, when I was writing this interview, I was thinking about, you know, almost how a company that's in trouble is almost like a plane that's in trouble. And then you have the concept of, you know, should the pilot be spending his or her time telling people what's going on or actually fixing the problem? I imagine that's a dynamic that constantly comes up in the restructuring profession.
But it does. Let me tell you, that's a good analogy. And when I'm trying to sell my service to a company, I say, listen, there is a rule in flying airplanes. When an airplane gets in trouble, one pilot flies it and the other pilot fixes it. If they both fly the airplane, they crash. If they both fix it, they crash. So somebody has to keep the airplane on a level playing field, and somebody has to figure out how to fix it. You have to do both. And that's why many times management teams need a co-pilot to help them through an area they've never navigated.
Yeah. Another really interesting question in this survey that jumped out at me, I'm going to quote here, when you personally handle a crisis, which leadership approach do you normally take? Now we're talking about turnaround scenarios here. 26.6% of the respondents said Democratic, give people a voice. Is that compatible with a turnaround scenario? Can you be Democratic when a company is in trouble like this and you need to fix it?
No. And if you'll notice on that survey, one of the lowest responses was authoritative, was 17%.
Right, and coercive, do what I say, was 4%.
Yeah. Authoritative is the way to go, right? And somebody has to step up and make a decision because the company is paralyzed. You know, Teddy Roosevelt once said, the best decision you can make is the right decision. The second best decision you can make is the wrong decision. The worst decision you can make is no decision. So that authoritative leadership, be able to stand up and say, we're going in this direction, but also you have to be good enough to admit you've made a mistake and make corrections as you go. But to lead a company out of a crisis, you have to be decisive and you have to get people to follow you, and you got to have people believe you're doing the right thing.
Mm. You also asked whether a firm's culture can affect financial performance. The overwhelming majority said it could. What's your take? What should the culture of a firm that's turning itself around be? I would imagine it changes pretty quickly once you have it out in the open.
Many times the culture is part of the problem, right? It's systemic. And what you see is that in order to drown out conflict in organizations, you see two extremes. And one extreme is the kind of culture where the decision's never made. Everything's put into a cross-functional team and everything just dies. The other is micromanagement, where everybody micromanages everything in the four walls of the company, but they don't manage the big stuff, like their customers leave and their employees leave, but they can control how many pencils you get. And so these cultures are stifling, and many times they have to change. And the only way to change a culture that quickly is intense focus. You have to find 3 levers you can pull to change that company, and you focus on those 3 levers, and you get everybody else focused on the 3 levers through communication, and you pull them and you measure them, because everybody many times is looking at the wrong stuff.
William, thanks so much for stopping by.
Well, thanks. Appreciate it.
That's William Snyder, co-head of the Corporate Restructuring Group at Deloitte. If you'd like to learn more about the issues we just discussed, be sure to go check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. You can see more of our videos on YouTube, and you can follow our updates on Twitter. I'm Pacchia. Thanks for watching.